Hello, and welcome to an extra spooky edition of Zilog and Moto, where I've got a game picked out for this week's review that's about as appropriate as it gets for this time of the season, when all the spooks and specters come out. Don't believe me? Just go look at my neighbor's house. I don't know how much money they spent on all that crap, but I've got a feeling it was more than the development budget for TNN Outdoors Bass Tournament 96. Anyway, if you're not familiar with this channel, Zilog and Moto is the place to go for reviews of anything 8 and 16-bit Sega. For almost 3 years now, I've been playing and reviewing games for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And not just releases that we got here in America. Oh, no. That would be far too simple, and pretty short-sighted in the case of the Master System, which had a much stronger lifespan in other areas of the world. So, as a result, my goal is to review every English language game for those consoles that came out back in the day, and maybe even a few newer titles as well. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, I'd ask you to subscribe, and then maybe someone else will see the channel as well because you subscribed. Who knows? What I do know is that I haven't done a Master System review in a while, with the last one being the New Zealand story, which is one of those titles that I was referring to that we didn't get in the United States. This is just one of those unfortunate things that happen when you're trying to balance things out so that there's not a bunch of Genesis games at one point in the schedule. But don't worry, I do love my Master System. Or at least the power base converter anyway, since realistically, that's what gets used most of the time. So, having said that, let's get to this week's game, which I was actually originally going to do in that New Zealand story spot, before Twitter made me think better of it and hold it out for this Halloween slot. And that game is Ghost House. Not just for the Master System, but as you can see, it's also one of the few games that was released in the Sega card format that actually predates the Master System and goes back to Sega's original 8-bit console, the SG-1000. I'd love to collect for the SG-1000, but I think it's probably more important for me to put that money into something more important. Like, house. But not this house. Ghost House is actually somewhat reasonable to purchase, with, as of the recording of this video, copies going for about $35 to $40 if you want a complete copy. I actually bought this one a few years ago at the Midwest Gaming Classic up in Milwaukee, along with a lot of other games. Just as an aside, the MGC is a great medium-sized convention, especially if you like pinball, so definitely check it out if you happen to be in the area. Back to Ghost House. The thing that all these Sega card releases have in common is that they're all limited to a tiny quarter of a megabit in storage, due to that being the limit of what the format is designed for. As a result, Sega card games tend to be fairly simple in nature, just due to Sega physically not being able to cram more data on a card to make a game out of. But one thing I've learned in doing this channel is just because a game is small does not mean it's bad. And if you need any proof of that, look no further than Astro Warrior. So, is Ghost House a fun but spooky arcade romp? Or is it that lame house on the street that gives out boxes of raisins instead of candy? Well, let's get out that PKE meter and investigate. But first, a look at the package. So this is the US version of Ghost House, which only released in this Sega card format. I mention this because while the initial release of the game was on Sega card in Japan, the US, and Europe, it was also released in a cartridge version as well for the PAL and Brazilian markets. The game, of course, is exactly the same, but if you wanted to play it on a Master System 2, which removed the Sega card slot in a cost-cutting measure, you would need to seek out that cartridge version. As it's the card version, you can see that it doesn't have the normal clamshell for Master System games, and instead it has this half-size case, and I do mean half-sized, as 2 of these take up the space on a normal clamshell. I really like these, mini cases, and I kind of wish that Sega had made more Sega card games as a result, but honestly, even late 1986, a quarter megabit was tiny for a game, so Sega would have had to figure out some other way to fit more data on these cards, and with the cartridge option, it just wasn't worth it. This case has held up relatively well. It's certainly not my best Master System game, but it could be a lot worse, considering it's almost 35 years old. There's a few marks to the outer cover, but nothing that actually gets all the way through, keeping the inner cover fully intact with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear. These mini cases did still have a hang tab like the regular clamshells, but this one has been removed unfortunately. As far as the front cover goes, if it wasn't enough to tell you that it was a Sega card released by coming in the mini case, Sega left nothing to chance by not only having the Sega card printed right on the cover, but then also having the cover art being someone holding the card, which in turn had the actual game artwork on a label on the card. It's a cover in a cover, or something. Sega did this with more or less all the Sega card releases except for Spy vs. Spy, which was just an odd release in general, coming out 2 years after all the other Sega card releases, and by that time Sega had started to finally get a bit more imaginative with their cover art. Flipping over the back, and here we have Sega's classic early Master System rear cover format, consisting of 2 screenshots at the top and then a bunch of flavor text at the bottom. The screenshots are decent quality for the time, but what I really like is the flavor text. As much as I complain about the poor cover art on non-Japanese Master System releases at the time, Sega always did a good job with making the game seem interesting via the flavor text, even simple ones. And I have to award points for this last line, "Ghoul luck, you'll need it." Opening the case up, and you'll see the Sega card with the original protective envelope. That's cool to see. And a manual that's clearly seen better days. If you haven't seen one of these before, one cool thing about the back of the card is that there's a small section to write your name. Very useful, as I could see these being misplaced much easier than a cartridge. The manual isn't very big, but being an arcade-style game, there's not a ton to explain. Even though it's relatively short, Sega did work in 2 screenshots and some original artwork that I always love to see on these early titles. It just gets your imagination going that much more when playing games that didn't have a ton of graphical detail. And then, of course, there's the classic high score section at the end, a hallmark of 80s Sega. Okay, that's the Sega card package. Let's see if the game is anywhere near as spooky as some of these pictures indicate. Before I get to it in Ghost House, let's talk a little bit about the history of the game. Being that Sega was always a strong representative in the arcade scene, and that Ghost House is solidly an arcade-styled platformer, you might assume that Ghost House is a port of a Sega arcade game from the 80s, just like many other Sega titles for the Master System and Genesis. And you would be correct. Sort of. You see, there was never an arcade version of Ghost House, specifically. But Sega did release an arcade game called Monster Bash in 1982, and you could definitely say that Ghost House was at very least inspired by Monster Bash. They're definitely different games, so don't go thinking that Monster Bash is just a primitive version of Ghost House, but both games do have decidedly creepy settings, and they're both action platformers where you take control of a spunky main character in an effort to fight monsters, including Dracula. However, while Monster Bash is a typical early 80s single-screen affair, with a rotating set of 3 screens like Donkey Kong, Ghost House has advanced to have horizontal scrolling and even multiple floors of the house to be explored in each level. The main game structure of Ghost House has you play as Mick, who could be considered an analog of Alex Kidd, big punch and all, but maybe during Alex's emo or metal phase, when he decided to comb his hair into a devil lock that wouldn't be out of place on a Misfits album cover. According to the game's story, Mick has inherited a bunch of his family's jewels, which is normally considered a good thing. But there's just one problem. Apparently his family decided for safekeeping that all the jewels should be stored in Dracula's mansion, which is, of course, a bad thing. Now, I've got to call out my first problem with this game. The name. You spend the entirety of the game exploring what is supposedly Dracula's mansion, right? Or, technically, Dracula's 6 mansions, but more on that in a minute. And in Dracula's mansion, you have to fight a total of 5 enemy types. First there's Death, who actually looks like a blue version of Grimace from McDonald's. Fun fact, apparently Grimace was originally conceived as an anthropomorphic taste bud, which is actually something I just learned 2 weeks ago. Anyway, next there's the Bats, which the game refers to as Darrow Bats for some reason, even though I have no earthly idea what a Darrow Bat is, and the manual refers to them as crazy baseball bats, just to make things even more confounding. Then there's the fire blower monster that, you guessed it, blows fire and can one-hit you if you're not careful. A mummy that you'll start to have to worry about if you're good enough to make it to the second mansion. And then finally Dracula himself, or more accurately, Dracula and 4 other vampires cosplaying as Dracula. But did you notice one monster that I didn't mention that you have to fight? Yes, that's right, the game doesn't feature a single ghost anywhere. So why on earth did Sega name the game Ghost House instead of Dracula's Mansion? I mean, I suppose you could consider Dracula's Mansion a haunted house, but it's just a weird name considering that there are no ghosts to be found. I guess we'll just blame the Japanese, as the game's name in Japan is literally Ghosto Houso, so it's not a translation issue. Moving on, I mentioned how you have to fight Dracula, seeing as how it's apparently his house and all, and as the game refers to it, 4 other fake Draculas. To be clear, the mansion is made up of 3 levels, a top level that I suppose could be referred to as a ground floor / attic, a mezzanine floor, and then finally the basement, with 5 coffins hidden throughout. Your goal is to fight the minor enemies in each area until you get a key, and then find one of the coffins, opening it with your key, and it's time for a Dracula fight. Assuming you defeat Dracula, or a reasonable facsimile, you'll gain a jewel, and thankfully a refill of your health bar before going to tackle the next one. And rinse and repeat until all 5 of the jewels have been recovered, which then spawns a level exit for you to find and move on to the next mansion, or round as the game refers to it. The game features a total of 6 rounds for you to fight your way through, and they are slightly different from one another in layout and rotating background wall colors. And that's about it. Battle horror themed enemies, collect jewels from Dracula's cold dead hands, and profit. From an actual design perspective, and taking into consideration that the entire game had to be crammed into a 1/4 megabit, I actually like what they came up with, and the game is certainly a vast improvement on the previously referenced Monster Bash. And honestly, it's not even really fair to compare them, as the link between the 2 games is even more tenuous than the one between Dragon Wang and Kung Fu Kid. And if that reference is too obscure for you, go take a look at the review I did for Kung Fu Kid earlier this year in episode 109. But I really like the concept of having 3 individual floors to the house, and then each floor having multiple levels requiring some platforming to navigate. Also, while at first it was a bit frustrating, I also like how there's some hidden walls and ground spots that can throw a curveball at you, mixing things up a bit. I also enjoy some of the more advanced gameplay techniques that were thrown in. And I'm using the term advanced very loosely there, but hang with me. Like the strategy involved in paying attention to what items are in the background of the mansion, and being able to trigger arrows and knives to be thrown at you on demand, allowing you to gain the knife and invincibility power-ups. There are some issues I have with the design though, and some of those are purely due to the limitations that they were working with, but others were definitely avoidable. The first issue I have is the inclusion of bats as an enemy. Okay, I'm only half serious here, but it seems like every single game that I've played for this channel that has had bats for an enemy has ultimately just been a pain in the ass rather than fun. At this point, it should almost be a rule of the channel. If the game has bats in it, take a star off the review score. And honestly, I don't mind them too much in Ghost House on their own, although their description in the manual still confuses me. The problem is it feels like there's too many of them, and it can make collecting arrows and knives while avoiding other enemies difficult. Then there's the issue of the ground level stairs. The ground level stairs are what take you down to the next floor, and normally you just climb down them. But if you're struck by an enemy, usually Dracula, you'll go flying down the stairs to the lower floor and have to climb back up and start your fight completely over. The Dracula fights can be frustrating enough. They don't need you getting knocked into a whole different area on the level on top of it. Finally, the Dracula fights themselves, or basically the core of the entire game. And I'm sure some of you are going to roll your eyes at this and simply reply with "get good" or something like that, but Dracula, when in bat form, flies way too fast, usually leading to you taking damage a few times. Then Dracula changes to human form too far away to hit, and then changing back into the bat to hit you again. And I do recognize that there is a strategy of making sure that you have a knife before the fight starts, or possibly getting an invincibility from collecting arrows,
or even possibly freezing the enemies by hitting the lights, if you haven't already done that too many times in a level, and that if you survive the fight, you do get a health refill. I don't know, it just seems like that Dracula should have been made a smidge slower, or the levels should be designed in such a way so that you wouldn't be having to contend with so many other enemies, i.e. bats, at the same time during the fights. And if you've only played the first round, you may not understand what I'm talking about, but during the second round, not only does the true Dracula come back to life and you have to fight him a second time, but all of the Draculas move even faster, which is where the problem really comes to light. However, other than those issues, I do enjoy the base gameplay setup. Moving around the levels, jumping and attacking seems to work as it should, and when you mix in the stop time, invincibility, and knife power-ups, it's a solid framework for a game. Unfortunately, once you've seen what's in the first two levels, you've pretty much seen all the game has to offer, and I think it would then take the truly dedicated to want to play through the rest of the game, as it's really just more of the same. It would have been nice if they could have kept adding enemies to the levels, like how the mummy first appears in level 2, with maybe a wolf man in level 3, an actual ghost in level 4, and so on, but I'm guessing this is where the size limitations of the Sega card come into play. Even with those size limitations, I like how the game looks from a graphical perspective. Yeah, it looks like a game from 1986, but as opposed to what you were seeing on other consoles at the time, the NES, the game has a nice color palette, and some nice details to all the sprites and items in the background. The game moves very fluidly for the most part, and I only experienced some small slowdown during certain Dracula fights that also involve a lot of other enemies on the screen at the same time, but this is not the norm. As you might expect, there's not much here on the audio front. The game features 2 songs for background music, one that plays during main gameplay, and then a boss track for when you're fighting Dracula. The tracks are relatively short, and under normal circumstances, they'd probably get annoying from repetition. However, due to all the action that's on the screen, there's plenty of sound effects that are played as well, and that does a decent job of breaking up the monotony. The sound effects themselves are nothing special, but they get the job done and match the on-screen action well. Coming up with a review score for this game is tough. On the one hand, I really want to like the game, as I do think it's a good idea for a game, with some interesting design elements, and graphically, the game is fine, especially for when it came out and being crammed into an extremely small package. But on the other hand, once you've played it for about 30 minutes, you've really seen all that it has to offer, and the Dracula fights really become more frustrating than anything else. As a result, I'm giving Ghost House 1 star, as while it's not a total bomb, I can't see many people wanting to put very much time into it with as repetitive as the gameplay is. Certainly give it a shot if you enjoy old school arcade style platformers and if you're curious about the Sega card format, but I wouldn't go out of your way to play this when there's much better platformers available on the console.
Believe it or not, sometimes I have to think really hard about what score I'm going to give a game, and Ghost House was one of those that I debated on for a while. On one hand, I wanted to give it at least 2 stars just due to the fact that it was an early release and that they didn't have much to work with, but then I thought about games like Hang On and Astro Warrior that had similar physical limitations, but were still better games. A few small tweaks here and there would have made a big difference, but I have to review the game that is, not what could have been. I think I like this concept of trying to do a horror-themed game review at Halloween. There's certainly other spooky games available for these consoles, like Ghouls and Ghosts, Splatterhouse 2 and 3, Night Trap, and of course the various actual Dracula games, so I think I'll keep trying to do this next year. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if there are other games I should reserve for future Halloween-centric reviews. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I'm mixing up the schedule a little bit, because I don't actually have a copy of the game I was planning on reviewing. Oops. Originally, I had Paperboy for the Genesis schedule for next week, but it's actually somewhat rare and I've never seen a complete copy in good condition in the local shops. Paperboy 2, on the other hand, I've got, so go figure. I'll try to get that straightened out soon, but in the meantime, it's a game on the Genesis about a game show that has seen an odd bit of controversy over the last few months, and certainly nothing that could have been predicted back in 1993 when this game was released. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. And remember, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.